You are nothing." The words echoed through the grand kitchen as the head cook's ladle clattered against the marble counter, sending droplets of gravy across Nora's threadbare apron. "You hear me, girl? Nothing. And you will never be anything more than the scraps we throw you." Nora kept her eyes down, her fingers clutching the edge of the wooden cutting board until her knuckles turned white. She had heard these words before. She had heard them so many times that they had become part of the rhythm of her breathing, woven into the fabric of her existence like the patches on her worn dress. 23 years of being invisible had taught her that silence was survival, that disappearing was the only protection she had in a world where power was everything, and she had none. The kitchen bustled around her with the organized chaos of preparing a feast for the royal court, dozens of servants moving with purpose while she remained as still as possible, hoping no one would remember she existed long enough to find another reason to remind her that she did not belong. The Mooncrest Palace kitchen was a cathedral of copper and flame, with ceiling-high windows that let in the afternoon light and cast everything in gold. But Nora had learned long ago not to look at beautiful things too closely, not to want what she could never have. She was an Omega without a wolf, a genetic anomaly that made her less than worthless in a society where your rank determined your value and your wolf determined your rank. Most Omegas were cherished, protected, their rarity making them precious. But an Omega without a wolf was just a broken thing, a mistake of nature that served no purpose except to remind everyone else how fortunate they were not to be her. She had been found as an infant on the steps of the Pack orphanage with no identification, no family, no explanation for why she existed at all. The orphanage had kept her until she was old enough to work, and the palace had taken her dean, because they needed someone to do the jobs that even the lowest servants considered beneath them. "The royal dinner is in 3 hours," the head cook barked, her meaty hands gesturing wildly at the chaos around them. 3 hours and the Alpha King himself will be dining with his betrothed, and the visiting dignitaries from the Northern Territories. Everything must be perfect. Everything. And you, Nora, you will stay in the back, and you will not show your face anywhere near the dining hall. Do you understand me? Nora nodded without speaking, her voice trapped somewhere deep in her chest, where it had lived for so long. She sometimes forgot she had one at all. The head cook grunted and turned away, already shouting orders at someone else, and Nora allowed herself one small breath of relief before returning to her task of peeling potatoes. Her hands moved mechanically, the knife sliding through the skin with practiced precision, while her mind wandered to the places it always went when the present became too heavy to bear. She wondered what it felt like to be seen, to walk into a room and have people acknowledge your presence, instead of looking through you as if you were made of glass. She wondered what it felt like to have a wolf, to feel that other presence inside you that everyone spoke of with such reverence and connection. She wondered if she would ever be more than this, more than the girl who peeled potatoes in the back of the kitchen while the world carried on without her. The afternoon wore into evening, and the kitchen reached a fever pitch of activity as platters of roasted meats and delicate pastries began their journey toward the grand dining hall. Nora worked in silence, her arms aching from hours of repetitive motion, her stomach growling because she had learned long ago that she ate only after everyone else had taken their fill. The sounds of laughter and music drifted down from the upper floors where the nobility gathered, a world so far removed from her reality that it might as well have existed on another planet. She had seen the Alpha King only a handful of times in the 5 years she had worked at the palace, always from a distance, always from the shadows where she belonged. Dominic Ashford was everything the legends said, and more. A man who commanded attention simply by existing, whose presence made even the strongest alphas bow their heads in respect. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that he kept slightly too long and eyes that were said to see through lies and deception with terrifying accuracy. He had taken the throne at 25 after his father's sudden death, and had spent the last 7 years consolidating power and forging alliances that made the Mooncrest Kingdom the most formidable force in the entire werewolf world. Nora, The sharp voice cut through her thoughts, and she looked up to find Margaret, one of the senior kitchen maids, gesturing urgently at her. "We need more wine from the cellar, the vintage," the king requested. "Go fetch it now before cook realizes we are running low." Nora set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron, grateful for any task that took her away from the suffocating heat of the kitchen. The wine cellar was located in the oldest part of the palace, deep underground where the temperature stayed cool year-round, and the stone walls held centuries of history within their bones. She navigated the narrow corridors with the ease of someone who had learned every hidden pathway, every servant's entrance, every route that allowed her to move through the palace without being seen. The cellars were quiet and dark, lit only by the occasional torch that cast dancing shadows on the ancient stones. Nora found the section where the king's private collection was kept, running her fingers along the dusty bottles until she located the vintage Margaret had specified. She pulled 3 bottles into her arms, balancing them carefully as she turned to make her way back. Upstairs. But as she rounded the corner, her foot caught on an uneven stone, and she stumbled forward, her heart leaping into her throat as the bottles began to slip from her grasp. She managed to catch 2 of them, but the third fell, and in that split second, before it shattered against the floor, time seemed to slow down, and she could see her entire pathetic existence playing out in front of her eyes. The crash when it came was deafening in the silence, red wine spreading across the stone floor. Like blood, the glass glittering in the torchlight like tiny diamonds. Nora dropped to her knees immediately, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the larger pieces of glass, panic rising in her chest because she knew what this meant. Broken bottles meant wasted resources. Wasted resources meant punishment. And punishment for someone like her meant going without meals, or being assigned to even worse tasks, or being reminded once again that she was nothing, and would always be nothing. She was so focused on the mess that she did not hear the footsteps approaching, until a deep voice spoke from somewhere above her. "You are bleeding." The words were quiet, almost gentle, and so unexpected that Nora's head snapped up before she could stop herself. Her eyes met his, and the world tilted sideways. Alpha King Dominic Ashford stood less than 3 feet away, his tall frame filling the narrow corridor, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be upstairs at the dinner, surrounded by nobility and dignitaries, not standing in the wine cellar watching a nobody Omega bleed onto his expensive vintage. Nora opened her mouth, but no sound came out, her voice lost somewhere between terror and confusion, and she looked down at her hands to see that he was right. Blood welled from a cut on her palm where she had grabbed one of the glass shards, mixing with the wine on her skin until she could not tell which was which. "I apologize, Your Majesty." The words finally came, barely more than a whisper, and she immediately looked back down at the floor because she knew better than to meet an Alpha King's eyes. "I will clean this up immediately. I will replace the bottle. I will accept any punishment you deem appropriate." She heard him move closer, and every instinct she had screamed at her to run, to disappear, to do anything except stay frozen on her knees in front of the most powerful man in the kingdom. But her body would not cooperate, her muscles locked in place by some force she could not name. She felt rather than saw him crouch down beside her, and when he spoke again, his voice held something she had never heard directed at her before. Curiosity. "What is your name?" Her name. He wanted to know her name. People did not ask her name. People did not look at her long enough to care about her name. "Nora," she whispered, still staring at the floor, at the wine and blood and broken glass that represented everything wrong with her existence. "Nora, Your Majesty." "Look at me, Nora." It was not a request. It was a command, spoken in that tone that alphas used when they expected immediate obedience, and her head lifted before her brain could process the instruction. His eyes were darker up close, almost black in the dim torchlight, and there was something in them that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He was looking at her. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, as if she were real, as if she mattered, as if she were more than the invisible girl who existed only to serve. "You work in the kitchens." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway, unable to form words under the weight of his attention. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement as if she were a wild animal that might bolt, and took her injured hand in his. His touch was warm and careful, his fingers gentle as he examined the cut, and Nora felt something crack open inside her chest, some long-buried part of herself that she had thought dead waking up at the contact. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. "This needs to be cleaned properly," he said, his thumb brushing across her palm in a way that sent electricity up her arm. "Come." He stood and pulled her to her feet with him, still holding her hand, and Nora's mind went completely blank. The Alpha King was touching her. The Alpha King was holding her hand. The Alpha King was leading her down the corridor toward what she dimly recognized as his private study, and none of this made any sense at all. They passed 2 guards who immediately straightened at the sight of their king, their eyes widening slightly when they noticed Nora, but neither dared to question him. The study was warm and lined with books, a fire crackling in the hearth and casting the room in amber light. Dominic guided her to a chair near the fire and released her hand only to retrieve a small medical kit from a cabinet against the wall. Nora sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sudden action would break whatever spell had caused this impossible moment to occur. He returned and knelt in front of her, taking her hand again and beginning to clean the wound with supplies from the kit. His movements were practiced and efficient, and she wondered absurdly how many injuries he had tended to in his life, how many battles he had fought, how many scars he carried beneath his fine clothes. "You have worked at the palace for how long?" he asked as he worked, his tone conversational as if this were a normal interaction, as if kings questioned servants in their private studies every day. "5 years, Your Majesty," Nora managed, her voice slightly steadier now that she was not drowning in the depths of his gaze. "I work mostly in the back kitchens, preparing vegetables, cleaning dishes, tasks that do not require direct contact with guests." He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or disapproval, she could not tell which. "And in 5 years, we have never crossed paths before this moment." Again, not a question, but she answered anyway. "I am very good at being invisible, Your Majesty. It is safer that way." His hands stilled on hers, and he looked up, meeting her eyes once more with that same unsettling intensity. "Safer." He repeated the word as if tasting it, as if trying to understand what it meant. "You believe you need to hide to be safe in my palace." It was not an accusation, but it felt like one anyway, and Nora dropped her gaze to their joined hands, to the sight of his strong fingers wrapped around her smaller ones, to the bandage he had just finished securing over her cut. "I am an Omega without a wolf, Your Majesty. I have no value and no protection. Invisibility is the only defense I have." The words came out before she could stop them, honesty spilling from her lips because something about his presence made it impossible to maintain the careful walls she had built around herself. She waited for him to laugh, to dismiss her, to remind her that she was right to hide because she was indeed worthless. But instead, he did something that shattered every assumption she had ever made about the world. He reached up with his free hand and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes again. "You are wrong," he said quietly, and there was something almost fierce in his voice, something that made her heart stutter in her chest. "You have more value than you know, more power than you have been allowed to discover, and you should never have to hide to feel safe." Before she could process those impossible words, before she could ask what he meant, the door to the study burst open, and a woman's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Dominic, darling, everyone is asking where you disappeared to in the middle of dinner." Lady Seraphina Blackthorn swept into the room in a cascade of emerald silk and expensive perfume, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed and her blue eyes sharp as glass. She was everything Nora was not: beautiful, powerful, confident, worthy of standing beside a king. Her gaze landed on Nora, and her perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of delicate confusion. "Oh, I see you have found a stray." Dominic released Nora's chin, but did not move away, did not create the distance that propriety demanded. "I was tending to an injury," he said calmly, finally releasing Nora's hand and standing to his full height. "Lady Seraphina, this is Nora. She works in the kitchens." Seraphina's smile was polite and cold, the kind of smile predators gave prey before they struck. "How charitable of you, my king, though perhaps it would be more appropriate for the servants to tend to their own, rather than taking you away from important matters of state." The dismissal was clear, the insult wrapped in silk and delivered with practiced precision. Nora stood quickly, her chair scraping against the floor, and lowered her head in a bow that made her spine ache. "My apologies for taking up your Majesty's time. I will return to my duties immediately." She moved toward the door, desperate to escape before the situation became even more humiliating. But Dominic's voice stopped her before she reached it. "Nora." She turned back reluctantly, finding him watching her with an expression she could not read. "Come to my study tomorrow evening, after the dinner service is complete. I wish to speak with you further." The request hung in the air like a grenade, and Nora could feel Seraphina's attention sharpening into something dangerous. "Your Majesty, I do not think that is necessary," Nora said quickly, knowing that accepting would only paint a target on her back that she could not afford to carry. "I am fine. The injury is minor. There is no need for further concern." Something flashed across Dominic's features, something that looked almost like disappointment, but his voice remained firm. "Nevertheless, tomorrow evening, that is not a request." And because he was the Alpha King and she was nothing, Nora had no choice but to bow her head in acceptance and flee the study before her legs gave out beneath her. She made it back to the kitchens in a daze, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened, her hand still tingling where he had touched her. The head cook took one look at her face and demanded to know what had taken so long. But Nora mumbled something about getting lost in the cellars and returned to her station before anyone could question her further. She worked through the rest of the evening in a fog, scrubbing pots and hauling water, and trying desperately not to think about dark eyes and gentle hands and words that promised she was more than nothing. But as she lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters that night, sleep eluding her while the other girls snored around her, she could not stop replaying every second of that encounter in the wine cellar. The way he had looked at her, the way he had touched her, the way he had spoken to her as if she were a person worthy of conversation instead of a piece of furniture to be ignored. And beneath all of that, beneath the confusion and the fear and the disbelief, was something else. Something small and fragile that she had thought long dead. Hope. It was dangerous and foolish, and would probably destroy her. But it was there nonetheless, blooming in the darkness like a flower that had finally found the sun. She pressed her bandaged hand against her chest, feeling her heart beat against her palm, and allowed herself to wonder, just for a moment, what tomorrow evening might bring. What did the Alpha King want with her? Why had he looked at her like that, as if he could see something she could not? And why did the memory of his touch make her feel like she was waking up from a very long sleep? The next day arrived with cruel inevitability, bringing with it a tension that Nora could feel in every muscle of her body. She moved through her morning duties with mechanical precision, peeling vegetables and hauling water, and trying to ignore the way Margaret kept shooting her curious glances. The head cook was in a foul mood, snapping at everyone who came within arm's reach, and complaining loudly about the Princess of the Northern Territories and her impossible dietary requirements. Nora kept her head down and her mouth shut, the way she always did, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She kept thinking about the king's command to meet him this evening, kept wondering what he could possibly want to discuss with someone like her. Part of her wanted to believe it was something simple, something innocent. Maybe he wanted to ensure she was healing properly, or perhaps he had questions about the kitchen operations. But another part of her, the part that had learned to expect cruelty from a world that had shown her nothing else, whispered that this was a trap, that she was being set up for some kind of humiliation she could not yet imagine. As the afternoon wore into evening, and the dinner preparations reached their usual crescendo, Nora felt her anxiety building until it was a physical presence in her chest. She burned her hand on a hot pot, dropped a tray of carefully arranged garnishes, and nearly collided with the head cook while carrying a stack of plates. By the time the dinner service began, and the servants started their endless trips between kitchen and dining hall, her nerves were stretched so thin she thought they might snap entirely. She worked in the back as always, washing endless streams of dishes, while the sounds of laughter and conversation filtered down from the grand dining room above. She tried not to think about the king sitting at the head of that table, tried not to imagine him making small talk with Lady O. Serafina, while the court watched and approved of their perfect political union. But the harder she tried not to think about it, the more her mind fixated on it, until she was scrubbing the same plate for the third time, and Margaret had to gently take it from her hands with a concerned look. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dinner service concluded and the kitchen staff began their nightly cleanup. The head cook dismissed everyone with warnings to arrive early tomorrow because apparently the Alpha King's mother was visiting, and everything needed to be even more perfect than usual. The other servants filed out in groups of 2s and 3s, heading back to their quarters to collapse into bed after another exhausting day. Nora lingered, pretending to organize the spice shelves while her heart hammered against her ribs. She waited until the kitchen was empty and silent except for the crackling of the dying fires. And then she carefully removed her stained apron and attempted to smooth down her hair. There was no mirror to check her appearance, but she knew it would not matter anyway. She was wearing the same threadbare dress she always wore. Her hands were rough and red from constant work, and her hair refused to cooperate no matter how many times she tried to tuck it behind her ears. She looked like exactly what she was, a nobody Omega who had no business being summoned to a king's private study. The walk through the palace corridors felt like a journey to an execution. Every step took her farther from the safety of the kitchens and deeper into the parts of the palace where people like her did not belong. She passed guards who watched her with vague suspicion, nobles who did not even register her existence, and servants who whispered behind their hands as she walked by. By the time she reached the door to the king's study, her entire body was trembling, and she had to take several deep breaths before she could bring herself to knock. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. 3 soft taps that seemed impossibly loud. For a moment there was only silence, and she allowed herself to hope that maybe he had forgotten. Maybe he was busy with more important matters. Maybe she could just turn around and pretend this had never happened. But then, his voice came from the other side of the door, deep and unmistakable. "Enter." Her hand shook as she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The study looked much as it had the previous night, warm and inviting with the fire, casting dancing shadows on the walls and the shelves of books, creating an atmosphere of quiet scholarship. But this time, there were no medical supplies waiting, no immediate crisis to explain her presence. The king stood by the window with his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him as he looked out over the palace grounds. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, without the formal regalia of court, just dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It made him look younger somehow, less intimidating, though the raw power that emanated from him was still palpable even in relaxation. "Close the door," he said without turning around, and Nora obeyed automatically, the soft click of the latch seeming to seal her fate in some way she did not understand. She stood just inside the door with her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for him to speak, to explain, to do something that would make sense of this bizarre situation. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the palace settling for the night. Finally, he turned to face her, and the impact of his full attention was no less overwhelming than it had been the first time. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes moving over her features as if memorizing them, and then he gestured to the chairs by the fire. "Sit, please." The please caught her off guard. Kings did not say, "Please." To servants, kings gave orders and expected obedience. But she moved to one of the chairs and perched on the edge of it, her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, every line of her body radiating the tension she felt. Dominic took the chair across from her, leaning back in a way that suggested comfort and ease, even though his eyes remained sharp and focused. "How is your hand?" he asked, nodding toward the bandage she still wore. "It is healing well, Your Majesty. Thank you for your care." The words were formal and polite, the kind of response she had been trained to give, but they felt hollow in the face of whatever was happening here. He made that same small sound she remembered from before, something between acknowledgement and dissatisfaction. "I did not ask you here to discuss your injury," he said after a moment, and Nora felt her stomach drop because if not that, then what? "I asked you here because I need to understand something that does not make sense to me." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "When I touched you yesterday, when I held your hand, I felt something I have never felt before in my entire life, and I need to know if you felt it too." The question hung in the air between them like a living thing, and Nora's mind went completely blank. She had felt something. Of course she had felt something. But how could she possibly admit that to him? How could she tell the Alpha King that his touch had awakened parts of her she did not know existed? That the memory of his hands on hers had kept her awake all night? That she had been terrified and thrilled in equal measure by the possibility of seeing him again? She opened her mouth, but no words came out, and Dominic leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, as he watched her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I am going to tell you something, Nora, and I need you to listen very carefully. I am going to tell you something that I have not told anyone else, not my advisors, not my betrothed, not even my own mother. And I am telling you because I believe you deserve to know the truth, even if the truth is complicated and dangerous, and might change everything." He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but certain. "You are my mate, my true mate. The bond I felt when I touched you was a mate bond, and I have been searching for you my entire life without knowing you existed." The words landed like bombs, each one detonating in Nora's chest with devastating force. Mate. True mate. Mate bond. These were words she had heard before, concepts she understood in theory but had never imagined could apply to her. Mates were sacred in werewolf society, the ultimate connection between two souls, the rarest and most precious gift the moon goddess could bestow. But mates were for people who mattered, for alphas and betas and powerful omegas with strong wolves and important bloodlines. Mates were not for broken girls without wolves who worked in palace kitchens and dreamed of being invisible. "That is not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring in her ears. "I do not have a wolf. I cannot be anyone's mate, least of all yours. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." Dominic shook his head, and there was something almost fierce in his expression now. Something that reminded her that he was not just a man, but a king, an alpha, a force of nature that commanded armies and ruled kingdoms. "You have a wolf," he said with absolute certainty. "Your wolf is there, Nora. I can feel her. She is dormant, sleeping, But she is there, and she is powerful. More powerful than you can possibly imagine. He stood and moved to the fireplace, bracing one hand against the mantel as he stared into the flames. I have spent the last 24 hours researching, consulting with the oldest texts in our library, speaking with the pack elders, under the pretense of academic interest. And everything I have learned points to the same conclusion. You are not what you think you are. You are not a broken omega without value. You carry the bloodline of the Silver Moon Pack, the ancient ruling family that was thought to have been wiped out 2 centuries ago in the Great Purge. Nora felt like the world was tilting beneath her feet, like everything she thought she knew was being ripped away and replaced with something she could not comprehend. The Silver Moon Pack was legend, myth, a story told to children about the most powerful wolves who had ever existed. They were said to have been able to control the moon itself, to wield magic that made them nearly invincible, to produce offspring whose wolves were so strong that other packs feared them. But they had been destroyed, hunted down and eliminated by a coalition of jealous rivals who could not bear to see such power concentrated in one bloodline. Or so the stories said. "Your Majesty," she said slowly, her mind struggling to keep up with the implications of what he was telling her. "Even if what you say is true, even if I do carry some distant trace of that bloodline, I still do not have a wolf. I have lived 23 years without any sign of one. How can I be your mate if I am not whole?" He turned back to her then, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like pain. The Silver Moon wolves were different from ours. They did not awaken at puberty like normal wolves do. They awakened only when they found their true mate, triggered by the bond itself. It is why the bloodline was so carefully protected, why mate bonds were sacred to them above all else. And it is why your wolf has remained dormant all these years. She was waiting for me. The explanation was fantastical, impossible, the kind of thing that happened in fairy tales and ancient legends, not in the real world where Nora scrubbed pots and tried not to starve. But, looking at Dominic's face, seeing the absolute conviction there, she could not bring herself to dismiss it entirely. "If this is true," she said carefully, testing the words as she spoke them, "then why tell me now? Why not wait until you are certain? Why risk everything by sharing this with someone who could easily be wrong, who could be nothing more than a delusional servant?" "Because you are not nothing," he said fiercely, moving back toward her with quick strides that ate up the distance between them. "Because I am tired of watching you hide in shadows and believe you are worthless. Because even if I am wrong, even if the mate bond is somehow a delusion and the bloodline is a fantasy, you still deserve better than the life you have been living." He stopped just in front of her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I want to help you awaken your wolf, Nora. I want to prove to you that you are so much more than they have made you believe. But I cannot do that without your consent, without your willingness to try. So I am asking you, not as your king, but as your mate. Will you let me help you discover who you really are?" The question was enormous, weighted with implications she could not begin to untangle. If she said yes, if she agreed to this insane proposal, she would be stepping into a world of danger and political intrigue that could destroy her. Lady Seraphina was already suspicious, already hostile, and that was before she knew about the mate bond. If the court found out that a nobody Omega was claiming to be the king's true mate, claiming to carry a legendary bloodline thought extinct, they would tear her apart. She would become a target, a threat, something to be eliminated before she could upset the careful balance of power that kept everything running smoothly. But if she said no, if she walked away from this moment and went back to her invisible life in the kitchens, she would spend the rest of her existence wondering what might have been, wondering if she had thrown away her one chance at something more, something real, something that made her feel alive instead of just surviving. She looked up at Dominic, at this powerful man who had no reason to care about her, but somehow did, and made a choice that terrified her. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but final. "Yes, I will try." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night, brilliant and warm and full of promise. "Thank you," he said softly, and then he did something that made her heart stop entirely. He knelt in front of her chair, bringing himself to her level, placing himself in a position of vulnerability that kings never assumed. "I know you are afraid. I know this seems impossible, but I swear to you, Nora, I will protect you. No matter what happens, no matter who tries to harm you, I will keep you safe. You have my word as your mate and your king." Before she could respond, before she could process the enormity of what was happening, he reached out and took both of her hands in his. The contact sent that same electric sensation through her body, that same feeling of rightness and connection that had stunned her the first time. But this time it was stronger, more intense, as if the bond was responding to her acceptance, to her willingness to acknowledge it. She felt something shift inside her, something deep in her chest where her wolf should have been, a stirring that was so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Dominic must have felt it too, because his grip on her hands tightened and his eyes widened slightly. "She is waking," he murmured, his voice filled with wonder. "Your wolf. I can feel her reaching for mine." And then, as if his words had given it permission, Nora felt it more clearly. A presence, warm and strong and undeniably real, uncurling inside her like a creature waking from hibernation. It was not fully there yet, not conscious or communicative, but it was there. Her wolf was there. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she gasped, tears springing to her eyes before she could stop them. "I can feel her," she whispered, wonder and disbelief tangling in her voice. "After all these years, I can finally feel her." Dominic released one of her hands to brush away the tears that had started to fall down her cheeks, his touch gentle and reverent. "She is strong," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "Stronger than my own wolf, I think. She is going to be magnificent when she fully awakens." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped and eyes locked, while the fire crackled beside them, and the world outside the study continued on without them. Nora felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop that would either destroy her or teach her to fly. And for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of falling. But the moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the study door, followed immediately by the door opening before Dominic could respond. Beta Marcus, the king's closest advisor and head of the royal guard, entered with an expression of barely concealed concern. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lady Seraphina is asking for you. She is in the main hall, and she is quite insistent." Dominic stood slowly, his jaw tightening with obvious frustration, but his voice remained controlled. "Tell Lady Seraphina I will join her shortly." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flicking to Nora with unconcealed curiosity, and Dominic's tone hardened slightly. "Shortly, Marcus. You may go." The beta bowed and retreated, closing the door behind him, and the brief interruption had been enough to remind Nora of the reality they existed in. This was not a fairy tale. This was a palace full of politics and expectations, and a betrothed lady who had every right to expect the king's attention. "I should go," Nora said quickly, standing and trying to put some distance between them before her nerve failed entirely. "You have duties. Lady Seraphina is waiting. I should not have taken so much of your time." Dominic caught her arm gently but firmly before she could move toward the door. "Wait. We need to discuss what comes next. The ritual of the blood moon is in 3 days. It is the most powerful moon of the year. the one night when the barrier between our human selves and our wolves is thinnest. If we perform the ancient claiming ritual during the blood moon, it should be enough to fully awaken your wolf and solidify our mate bond. But it must be done in secret, at least until you are strong enough to withstand the backlash that will come when the court learns the truth. Nora stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A claiming ritual, the blood moon, secrecy and deception, and all the complications that came with trying to hide something as fundamental as a mate bond. Your Majesty, she said carefully, you are betrothed to Lady Seraphina. You have a political alliance that depends on that union. Even if I am your true mate, even if my wolf awakens and proves I carry the Silver Moon bloodline, you cannot simply set aside your responsibilities because of one Omega. His eyes flashed with something dangerous, something that reminded her that beneath the careful control was an alpha who did not accept limitations easily. I can and I will, he said flatly. The betrothal to Seraphina is political convenience, nothing more. It was arranged by my advisors before I took the throne, a way to secure the alliance with the Blackthorn Pack. But mate bonds supersede all political arrangements in our law. Once our bond is recognized, once your wolf awakens and the court can see the proof, no one will be able to challenge our union without challenging the moon goddess herself. It sounded so simple when he said it like that, as if awakening her wolf and claiming their mate bond would solve everything, as if the political ramifications and social upheaval would simply fall into place. But Nora had lived her entire life watching the way power worked in the shadows, and she knew it would not be that easy. Lady Seraphina will not accept this quietly, she said, voicing the fear that sat heavy in her chest. She has been planning to be queen for years. She has the support of the most powerful noble families, and she will see me as exactly what I appear to be, a nobody Omega trying to steal what belongs to her. Dominic's expression softened slightly, and he reached up to cup her face with one hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with heartbreaking gentleness. Then we will deal with Seraphina when the time comes. But first, we awaken your wolf and prove to everyone, including yourself, that you are exactly who I know you are. Before she could respond, before she could voice any of the 1,000 concerns swirling through her mind, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, in a gesture that was more reverent than romantic. The touch sent warmth flooding through her entire body, and she felt her wolf stir again, stronger this time, more insistent. 3 days, he murmured against her skin. Meet me in the moon garden at midnight on the night of the blood moon. Can you do that? Nora nodded, not trusting her voice, and Dominic pulled back with obvious reluctance. Go now, before Marcus returns with more insistent demands. And Nora? She paused at the door, looking back at him. Do not doubt yourself. Do not let them convince you that you are nothing. You are my mate, my queen, whether you believe it yet or not. The words followed her out of the study and through the corridors back to the servants' quarters, echoing in her mind long after she had collapsed onto her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Nora moved through, her duties on autopilot, peeling vegetables and scrubbing pots, while her mind replayed every word of her conversation with the king. She kept waiting for something to happen, for guards to come and drag her away, for daring to presume above her station, for Lady Seraphina to appear with accusations and threats, for the entire castle to somehow know what had transpired in that study. But nothing happened. The palace continued its usual rhythms. The servants gossiped about the same petty dramas. And Nora remained invisible, just as she always had been. Except now, invisibility felt different. Now it felt like a disguise she was wearing rather than her natural state, a temporary condition that would soon be stripped away to reveal whatever lay beneath. She caught glimpses of the king over those 3 days, always from a distance, always surrounded by advisors or nobles or foreign dignitaries. He never looked in her direction, never gave any indication that she existed to him. And she told herself that was exactly as it should be. But there were moments, brief seconds when their eyes would meet across a crowded hallway or through an open doorway. And in those moments, she could feel the bond humming between them like a taut string, vibrating with unspoken recognition. She also saw Lady Seraphina more than she wanted to. The beautiful noblewoman gliding through the palace like she already owned it, her hand possessively on Dominic's arm during formal dinners, her laugh high and artificial when he spoke. Nora tried not to feel jealous, tried to remind herself that Seraphina's claim was political while hers was sacred, but the emotion came anyway, hot and bitter in her chest. On the second day, she overheard two of the senior maids discussing the upcoming blood moon ritual. Apparently, it was a major event in the royal calendar, a night when the entire pack gathered in the ceremonial grounds to run under the full moon and honor their wolves. The king would lead the ritual as he always did, shifting into his massive black wolf and racing through the forest with the strongest members of the pack following behind. It was supposed to be a celebration of their nature, a reminder of the wildness that lived beneath their civilized exteriors. Nora listened to them discuss it with a strange mix of longing and dread. She had never participated in a pack run, had never shifted because she had no wolf to shift into, had always spent blood moon nights alone in her room, while everyone else celebrated their connection to something she could not access. But if Dominic was right, if the claiming ritual worked, this blood moon would be different. This would be the night she finally became whole. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The day of the blood moon dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered. There was a tension in the air that Nora could feel even through the thick walls of the palace, an electricity that made her skin prickle and her non-existent wolf stir restlessly in her chest. The kitchen was chaos as usual, everyone preparing the feast that would take place before the ritual. But Nora barely registered the activity around her. Her mind was fixed on midnight, on the moon garden, on the claiming ritual that would either change everything or prove that she had been a fool to hope for more. She worked mechanically through the day, her hands performing familiar tasks while her thoughts spiraled between excitement and terror. What if it did not work? What if her wolf remained dormant despite everything? What if Dominic realized he had made a mistake, that the bond he felt was imagined or misdirected, that she truly was just a broken omega with delusions of grandeur? As evening approached and the feast began, Nora found herself unable to eat the scraps the kitchen staff was allowed after serving the nobles. Her stomach was tied in knots, her entire body vibrating with nervous energy that had nowhere to go. She excused herself early, claiming exhaustion, and retreated to her room to wait for the hours to pass. The other servant girls barely noticed her departure, too excited about the ritual to care about one quiet omega who never participated anyway. Nora sat on her cot and watched the sliver of moon visible through her tiny window, watching it rise higher and higher into the sky as midnight approached. When the old clock in the servants' hall chimed 11 times, she stood and changed out of her work dress into the only other garment she owned, a simple gray dress that was slightly less worn than her usual outfit. She brushed her hair as best she could, washed her face in the small basin, and tried to calm the trembling in her hands. At 1:45, she slipped out of her room and into the darkened hallways. The palace was eerily quiet, most of the inhabitants already gathered at the ceremonial grounds for the main ritual. She made her way through familiar corridors, and then into areas she rarely visited, following the directions Dominic had given her toward the moon garden. It was located in the oldest part of the palace grounds, a walled garden that had supposedly been planted by the first Alpha King centuries ago and maintained through generations as a sacred space. Nora had never seen it before, had only heard whispered descriptions from servants who occasionally were assigned to tend its specialized plants. She found the entrance easily enough, an arched doorway covered in climbing vines that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. She stepped through, and her breath caught in her throat. The moon garden was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that seemed at odds with the manicured perfection of the rest of the palace grounds. Silver-leafed plants grew in apparently random patterns, their foliage catching and reflecting the moonlight until the entire garden seemed to shimmer with otherworldly luminescence. At the center of the garden stood an ancient stone altar, weathered by time, but still solid, still powerful in its simplicity. And beside the altar stood Dominic, his dark clothing making him almost invisible in the shadows until he stepped forward into the moonlight. He had changed from his formal attire into simple black trousers and a loose white shirt, his feet bare on the grass, and there was something different about him, something wild and untamed, that she had not seen before, as if the proximity of the blood moon had brought his wolf closer to the surface. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice that made her realize he had been genuinely worried she might not show. "I gave you my word," Nora replied, moving closer to him with hesitant steps. "I do not break my promises, even when I am terrified of what keeping them might mean." His smile was warm and genuine, softening the harsh planes of his face. "Your honesty is refreshing. Most people tell me only what they think I want to hear." They stood facing each other in the moonlight, the garden silent around them, except for the distant sounds of the pack celebration carrying on the wind. Nora could feel the pull of the moon herself, stronger than she had ever felt it before, as if the blood moon was calling to the wolf that slept inside her. "How does this work?" she asked, needing practical details to anchor herself against the surreal nature of this moment. "The claiming ritual. What do we need to do?" Dominic gestured to the altar behind him. "The ancient texts describe a ceremony that requires blood, moonlight, and intent. We each offer a drop of blood to the altar, while speaking the words of claiming under the light of the blood moon. The magic inherent in your bloodline should respond to the ritual, and the mate bond should act as a catalyst to awaken your wolf fully. In theory." The "in theory" hung in the air between them, a reminder that for all their research and conviction, this was still an experiment, a gamble with stakes neither of them could fully comprehend. "And if it does not work?" Nora asked quietly. "If my wolf does not wake?" Dominic closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her face in both his hands with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Then we try again, and again, as many times as it takes. I am not giving up on you, Nora. I am not giving up on us." The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that she was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth claiming, made something crack open inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the hope building in her heart. "Okay," she whispered. "Tell me what to do." Dominic led her to the altar, positioning her on one side while he stood on the other. He produced a small ceremonial knife from somewhere, its blade gleaming silver in the moonlight, and offered it to her first. "A single drop on the altar stone. Then speak these words after me. I claim this bond under the light of the blood moon. I accept the gift of my mate. I awaken that which sleeps." Nora took the knife with trembling hands and pressed the tip against her palm, wincing slightly as it broke the skin. She held her hand over the altar and watched as a single drop of blood fell onto the ancient stone. The moment it made contact, the stone seemed to pulse with a faint silver light. So quick. She almost thought she imagined it. She spoke the words Dominic had given her, her voice growing stronger with each phrase. "I claim this bond under the light of the blood moon. I accept the gift of my mate. I awaken that which sleeps." Dominic repeated the process, his blood joining hers on the altar, his voice deep and resonant as he spoke the same words. And then something extraordinary happened. The moonlight intensified, becoming almost solid as it poured down into the garden, and Nora felt her wolf surge forward inside her with a force that drove her to her knees. It was not the gentle stirring she had felt before. This was a tidal wave of sensation and power, a presence so strong and so real that she could not understand how she had ever lived without feeling it. Her wolf was awake, fully, completely, undeniably awake. And she was magnificent. Nora could feel her wolf's strength, her intelligence, her fierce protective instincts, and her bone-deep recognition of Dominic as mate. It was overwhelming and exhilarating and terrifying all at once, and Nora heard herself gasp as her body began to change. The shift was unlike anything she had imagined, a transformation that was both painful and euphoric as her bones restructured and her muscles reformed. She was dimly aware of Dominic shifting beside her, his massive black wolf appearing where the man had stood. But most of her attention was focused inward on the miracle happening within her own body. And then it was done. She stood on 4 legs instead of 2, covered in silver-white fur that caught the moonlight and seemed to glow with inner radiance. She turned her head and caught sight of her reflection in the small pond at the edge of the garden, and what she saw took her breath away. Her wolf was larger than any Omega wolf should be, nearly as big as an alpha, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly silver light. She looked powerful. She looked dangerous. She looked like she could stand beside a king and not seem small. Dominic's wolf approached her carefully, his movements slow and non-threatening despite his size. When he was close enough, he lowered his head and nuzzled her neck in a gesture of welcome and affection, and Nora felt the mate bond snap into place with devastating completeness. It was not the faint pull she had felt before. This was a connection so profound it felt like their souls were intertwined, like she could feel his emotions and thoughts bleeding into her own, like she would always know exactly where he was and whether he was safe. Her wolf responded to his with pure joy, pressing against him and making a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl of satisfaction. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 wolves illuminated by moonlight, celebrating the bond that had brought them together. And then Dominic pulled back and looked toward the forest beyond the garden walls, his intention clear. He wanted to run. He wanted to celebrate their bond the way wolves had celebrated for millennia, racing through the wilderness with his mate beside him. Nora hesitated for only a second before she bolted toward the garden wall. There was an opening she had not noticed before, a gap that led directly into the forest, and she poured through it with Dominic on her heels. The night exploded into sensation as they ran, her new wolf senses overwhelming her with input she had never experienced before. She could smell everything, the rich earth beneath her paws, the green scent of living plants, the musk of small animals hiding in the underbrush, the clean, powerful scent of her mate running beside her. She could hear the symphony of the forest, every rustle and chirp and distant howl painting a picture more vivid than sight alone could provide. And she could feel the moon above them, not just as a source of light, but as a presence, a force that connected her to something ancient and primal and absolutely right. They ran for what might have been hours, or might have been minutes, time losing all meaning in the face of pure sensation and freedom. Dominic led her deeper into the forest, away from the palace and the pack grounds, to places where no human had walked in generations. Eventually, they came to a clearing with a small waterfall feeding into a crystal-clear pool, and they stopped to drink. Nora lapped at the cold water gratefully, her new body demanding hydration after the exertion of the run. She caught movement in the pool's surface and looked up to find Dominic had shifted back to his human form, standing naked and completely unself-conscious in the moonlight. She felt her wolf retreat slightly, allowing her human consciousness to take control. And then she was shifting too, the transformation back to human form even stranger than the shift to wolf had been. She stood on shaky legs, abruptly aware that she was also naked, her dress having been destroyed during the shift. She crossed her arms over her chest instinctively, but Dominic was already moving toward her with his shirt in his hands, wrapping it around her shoulders with gentle efficiency. "That was incredible," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he fastened the shirt closed over her. "Your wolf is perfect. You are perfect." Nora looked up at him, at this man who had seen value in her when no one else had, who had believed in her when she could not believe in herself, who had given her back a part of her soul she never knew was missing. "I can feel her," she said wonderingly, one hand pressed to her chest where her wolf now resided. Quiet, but present. She is there. She is real. After all these years, I am finally whole. Dominic pulled her into his arms, holding her close while the moon shone down on them and the forest whispered its approval. "You were always whole," he murmured into her hair. "You just needed someone to help you see it." They stayed like that for a long time, two people who had found each other against all odds, celebrating the bond that made them complete. But eventually, reality intruded as it always did. They had to return to the palace, had to face the consequences of what they had done, had to navigate the political minefield that awaited them when the court discovered that the invisible Omega had awakened as a powerful silver moon wolf and claimed the mate bond with their king. The walk back through the forest was slower, more contemplative, both of them aware that they were walking toward a storm. When they reached the garden, Dominic retrieved clothing he had stashed earlier, and they both dressed in silence. "What happens now?" Nora asked, adjusting the simple dress he had brought for her. "Do we tell the court immediately? Do we confront Lady Serafina? Do we hide this until we have a stronger political position?" Dominic considered for a moment before responding. "Tomorrow, I will call an emergency council meeting. I will present you to the court as my true mate and declare the betrothal to Serafina void. It will cause chaos. There will be challenges and protests, and possibly attempts to discredit or harm you. But delaying will only make things worse, and I refuse to hide what we are." The plan was bold and dangerous, and would almost certainly result in exactly the kind of backlash Nora feared. But looking at Dominic's face, seeing the determination there, she found herself nodding in agreement. They had come too far to turn back now. "Then I will stand beside you. Tomorrow," she said quietly, "and I will face whatever comes." He smiled and pulled her close for a kiss that was both promise and celebration, a kiss that sealed their fate more surely than any ritual ever could. When they finally pulled apart, the sky was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. The blood moon was setting, taking its magic with it, but the changes it had wrought remained. Nora's wolf was awake. The mate bond was complete. And tomorrow, the entire kingdom would learn that their invisible Omega was actually a queen. They separated at the garden entrance, Dominic heading back to the royal wing, while Nora made her way to the servants' quarters. She slipped into her room, just as the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the window, collapsing onto her cot with exhaustion and exhilaration warring in her chest. She could still feel her wolf, a warm, steady presence that had already become as natural as breathing. She could still feel Dominic through the mate bond, distant now but undeniably there, a connection that would never break no matter the distance between them. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, the first truly peaceful sleep she had experienced in years. When she woke several hours later to the sounds of the other servants beginning their day, she felt different, stronger, more certain of herself and her place in the world. She rose and dressed and made her way to the kitchens, moving through the familiar motions while her mind churned with anticipation of what the day would bring. The summons came mid-morning. A royal guard appeared in the kitchen doorway and announced that all palace staff were required to attend an emergency council meeting in the throne room at noon. The head cook grumbled about interrupted meal preparations, but no one dared disobey a direct order from the king. The servants filed out of the kitchen in confused clusters, speculation running wild about what could possibly require the entire palace. Staff to attend a council meeting. Nora walked among them, her heart pounding, but her spine straight, knowing that in less than an hour, her entire life would change irrevocably. The throne room was already packed when they arrived. Nobles and guards and servants all crowding into the massive space while trying to maintain some semblance of their respective social hierarchies. Nora found a spot near the back, where servants were expected to stand, but she kept her eyes on the dais where the throne sat empty, waiting for its king. When Dominic entered, the room fell silent. He was dressed in full royal regalia, the crown of the Mooncrest Kingdom resting on his head, his bearing commanding immediate attention and respect. But what captured everyone's focus was the fact that Lady Seraphina was not on his arm as expected. Instead, she stood to the side with Beta Marcus and the other council members, her beautiful face carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with suspicion. Dominic ascended to the throne and surveyed the assembled crowd with the calm authority of someone who had been born to rule. "I have called you all here today to make an announcement that will affect the future of our kingdom," he began, his voice carrying easily through the cavernous room. "For years, I have honored the betrothal arranged between myself and Lady Seraphina Blackthorn, a political alliance designed to strengthen our ties with the Northern Territories. But last night, during the sacred blood moon ritual, the moon goddess revealed a truth that supersedes all political arrangements." The crowd stirred with confused murmurs, and Nora felt every muscle in her body tense as Dominic's eyes found hers across the sea of people. "I have found my true mate," he continued, and the murmurs grew louder. "Under werewolf law and the ancient traditions that govern us all, a true mate bond takes precedence over any other commitment. Therefore, I am formally dissolving my betrothal to Lady Seraphina, effective immediately." The throne room erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted questions, servants gasped in shock, and Seraphina's careful neutrality cracked into an expression of pure fury. But Dominic raised one hand and the room quieted, years of conditioning to obey their alpha king, overriding their surprise and outrage. "My mate is here among us," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers. "And I ask her now to come forward and take her rightful place at my side." Every eye in the room turned, scanning the crowd, looking for some obvious candidate among the noble ladies present. Nora took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began walking toward the dais. The crowd parted before her in confusion, not understanding why a servant was moving through their ranks, not comprehending what was happening until she was halfway to the throne, and Dominic's smile made his intention clear. The gasps that followed were audible, shock rippling through the assembled nobility like a physical wave. Nora climbed the steps to the dais on shaking legs, very aware of hundreds of eyes boring into her back, very conscious of the whispers that had already begun. Freak. Nobody. Delusional. The words reached her ears but could not touch her, not when Dominic was reaching for her hand, not when her wolf was purring with satisfaction at being near their mate, not when she could feel the rightness of this moment in every cell of her body. "This is Nora," Dominic announced, keeping her hand clasped firmly in his. "My true mate, and your future queen." The throne room descended into absolute pandemonium. Lady Seraphina's voice cut through the noise first, high and sharp with disbelief. "This is insane. She is an Omega, a servant. She does not even have a wolf. You cannot possibly expect us to accept this farce." Dominic's expression hardened, his alpha authority rolling off him in waves that made even the strongest wolves in the room lower their eyes. "Nora carries the bloodline of the Silver Moon Pack, the ancient ruling family thought extinct. Her wolf awakened last night during our claiming ritual, and she is more powerful than any Omega you have ever encountered. Any who doubt this are welcome to challenge her directly and see for themselves." The silence that followed was deafening. No one wanted to challenge the king's mate directly, not when he was standing right there radiating barely contained violence. But the disbelief and hostility were palpable in the air. What happened next was pure political theater. Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her beautiful face arranged into an expression of hurt confusion. My king, surely you have been deceived. Surely this girl has used some kind of trickery or manipulation to convince you of a mate bond that cannot possibly exist. I beg you to reconsider before you throw away years of careful diplomacy for what can only be an enchantment or delusion. It was a masterful play, positioning herself as the concerned party looking out for Dominic's best interests while painting Nora as a manipulative villain. The court murmured in agreement, many heads nodding at Serafina's reasonable tone. But before Dominic could respond, before the narrative could solidify around Serafina's version of events, Nora felt her wolf surge forward with sudden, fierce protectiveness. She had spent her entire life being silent, being invisible, letting others define her worth. But she was not that person anymore. She was a silver moon wolf, a true mate to a king, and she would not hide from this challenge. "I have used no deception," Nora said, her voice quiet, but carrying through the silent throne room with unexpected authority. "The mate bond is real and verifiable by any pack elder or spiritual leader you wish to consult. My wolf is awake, and anyone with the ability to sense pack bonds can feel her presence. I did not seek this. I did not ask for any of this. But I will not apologize for accepting the gift the moon goddess has given me." She felt Dominic's pride through the mate bond, felt his wolf's approval of her strength, and it gave her the courage to continue. "I understand that my presence here disrupts the political plans many of you have made. I understand that I do not fit the image you had of your future queen, but I am the king's true mate, chosen by forces beyond any of our control, and I will not pretend to be less than I am to make others comfortable." The speech was not eloquent or practiced, but it was honest, and something in Nora's voice made even the most skeptical nobles pause. Dominic stepped forward to stand beside her, his hand still clasped in hers, presenting a united front that would be difficult to break. "The council will have 3 days to verify the mate bond and Nora's bloodline," he announced. "We will submit to whatever tests and examinations you deem necessary. But at the end of those 3 days, when the truth is confirmed, I expect this court to welcome their new queen with the respect and honor she deserves. Those who cannot accept this reality are free to leave my service." It was both an olive branch and a threat, giving the court time to adjust while making it clear that adjustment was not optional. Beta Marcus stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, if I may, the council will need access to the ancient texts to verify the claims about the Silver Moon bloodline. We will also need to consult with pack elders and perform the traditional mate bond verification ritual. This will take time." "You have 3 days," Dominic repeated firmly. "Use them wisely." The council meeting dissolved into smaller clusters of conversation, nobles and advisors huddling together to discuss this unprecedented development, while servants whispered and stared at Nora with expressions ranging from awe to suspicion to outright hostility. Nora stood on the dais beside Dominic, trying to appear calm and confident while internally she was screaming. She had just become the most talked-about person in the entire kingdom, and not in a good way. She could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes, the judgment and doubt and outrage directed at her like physical blows. But she could also feel Dominic beside her, solid and unwavering, and her wolf inside her, strong and certain. She was not alone anymore. She would never be alone again. The next 3 days were a special kind of torture. Nora was moved from the servants' quarters to a guest room in the royal wing, a space so luxurious it made her uncomfortable just being in it. She was assigned royal guards who followed her everywhere, supposedly for her protection, but feeling more like jailers. She was subjected to endless examinations by pack elders who poked and prodded and demanded she shift repeatedly to verify her wolf's existence. She sat through interviews with council members who asked increasingly invasive questions about her past, her relationship with the king, her intentions toward the throne. And through it all, she could feel the hostility of the court pressing down on her like a physical weight. Most nobles refused to acknowledge her existence, looking through her as if she were still invisible. Servants who had worked beside her for years now avoided her, as if she carried plague. And Lady Seraphina watched everything with cold, calculating eyes, clearly plotting her next move. Dominic tried to be present as much as possible, but his duties as king kept him busy with damage control and political maneuvering. He spent hours closeted with Beta Marcus and the council, trying to salvage alliances that had been built on his betrothal to Seraphina. He met with the Blackthorn family representatives who had come to the palace in outrage, demanding explanations and threatening to withdraw their support. And he stood firm through all of it, never wavering in his commitment to Nora. Never. Suggesting that perhaps this was too difficult or too complicated to pursue. Through the mate bond, Nora could feel his stress and exhaustion, could sense the toll this was taking on him, and she hated that she was the cause of so much chaos. But every time doubt crept in, every time she considered walking away to make things easier for everyone, her wolf would snarl in defiance, and Dominic would somehow appear to reassure her that she was worth fighting for. On the second day of examinations, one of the oldest pack elders, a woman named Helena, who had served the royal family for 60 years, pulled Nora aside after a particularly grueling shifting demonstration. "Child," she said quietly, her ancient eyes studying Nora with unsettling intensity. "I have lived long enough to see many things, and I know the truth when I see it. Your wolf is genuine. Your bloodline is real. The mate bond between you and our king is as authentic as any I have witnessed in my long life." Nora felt tears prick her eyes at the validation, at having someone finally believe her without suspicion or doubt. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." Helena reached out and patted her hand with surprising gentleness. "The court will come to accept you in time. Not because they want to, but because they will have no choice. You are stronger than you know, child. Do not let their fear make you small again." The words stayed with Nora through the rest of the examinations, through the whispered insults she overheard, through the increasingly desperate schemes she could feel Seraphina weaving in the shadows. She might be new to power, new to politics, new to being seen, but she had survived 23 years of invisibility and marginalization. She could survive this too. On the evening of the third day, the council convened to deliver their official verdict. The throne room was packed again, everyone eager to hear whether the council would validate the king's mate claim or find some technicality to invalidate it. Nora stood beside Dominic on the dais, her hand clasped in his, her spine straight, and her chin high despite the fear churning in her stomach. Beta Marcus stepped forward as the council's spokesman, his expression grave but his eyes showing a hint of approval that gave Nora hope. "If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?" After 3 days of extensive examination and consultation with our oldest texts and most knowledgeable elders, Marcus began, his voice formal, and carrying through the silent room. "The council has reached a unanimous conclusion regarding the claims made by His Majesty King Dominic Ashford." The pause felt like an eternity, every second stretching into infinity, while Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. "We confirm that Nora does indeed carry the bloodline of the Silver Moon Pack. Her wolf, while dormant until recently, exhibits characteristics consistent with the ancient texts describing that legendary line. Furthermore, we confirm that a genuine mate bond exists between Nora and His Majesty, validated through traditional rituals and verified by multiple independent witnesses. Therefore, it is the council's official position that Nora should be recognized as the king's true mate and afforded all rights and protections associated with that status." The announcement sent a ripple of reaction through the crowd, some looking relieved, others openly dismayed, but all recognizing that the council's verdict was final. Dominic's hand tightened on Nora's, his satisfaction and relief flooding through the mate bond, and she felt her own wolf settle with contentment at the official recognition. But the celebration was short-lived, because Lady Seraphina stepped forward, her beautiful face twisted with barely contained rage. "This is absurd," she hissed, all pretense of civility abandoned in the face of her defeat. You would overturn centuries of tradition, ignore political necessity, and elevate a nobody Omega to queen based on some mystical bloodline claim that convenient appeared exactly when needed? I will not accept this. My family will not accept this. And I promise you, King Dominic, you will regret choosing her over the alliance with my pack. The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable, and Nora felt ice run down her spine because she knew Serafina meant every word. Dominic's expression hardened, his alpha authority flooding the room until even the strongest wolves present felt the urge to submit. Lady Serafina, you will address your king with respect, or you will find yourself removed from this palace and stripped of your family's privileges. The mate bond is not something I chose or manufactured for political convenience. It is sacred law, older than any alliance, more binding than any contract. You may rage against it all you wish, but it will not change reality. For a moment, it seemed like Serafina might actually attack, her entire body vibrating with fury, her wolf pressing against her control. But then she visibly pulled herself together, smoothing her features into a mask of cold disdain. Very well, Your Majesty. I can see that reason will not prevail here. I will take my leave of your court and return to my family's territory. But mark my words, this is not over. The Blackthorn pack has a long memory, and we do not forgive insults easily. She turned and swept from the throne room with her head held high, her supporters following in her wake, and the atmosphere lightened perceptibly once she was gone. But Nora knew better than to feel relieved. Serafina's departure was strategic, a retreat to regroup and plan rather than a genuine surrender. The battle was far from over. In the days that followed, life settled into a new and strange rhythm. Nora was officially recognized as the king's mate and began the process of learning what it meant to be queen. She was assigned tutors to teach her protocol and etiquette, advisors to brief her on political alliances and court dynamics, and servants to help her navigate the complex world of royal fashion and public appearances. It was overwhelming and exhausting and nothing like her previous existence, but through it all, Dominic was there. He supported her through every misstep, defended her against every whispered criticism, and reminded her constantly that she belonged exactly where she was. The formal coronation ceremony was scheduled for the next full moon, a month away, giving Nora time to prepare and the court time to adjust to their new reality. But even as preparations moved forward, even as Nora slowly began to find her footing in her new role, she could feel the undercurrent of tension that permeated the palace. Not everyone was happy about her elevation. Not everyone accepted the mate bond as legitimate. And somewhere out there, Serafina was plotting her revenge. But, standing in the moon garden on a quiet evening, Dominic's arms wrapped around her as they watched the sunset together. Nora found she was not afraid. She had her wolf. She had her mate. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, and a purpose that made her feel truly alive for the first time in her existence. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever storms Serafina might unleash, Nora would face them standing tall instead of cowering in shadows. She had spent too long being invisible, accepting scraps and silence while the world moved on without her. But those days were over. Now the world would bend in her direction, not because she demanded it, but because she had finally learned to demand space for herself. She was Nora, mate to the Alpha King, carrier of the Silver Moon bloodline, and the future queen of the Mooncrest Kingdom. And she would never be invisible again.